My car broke down in the middle of a snowstorm, miles away from the nearest help, but I had no idea that what lay ahead would be far more terrifying than the cold. I grew up in the kind of town where winters felt endless. Thick snow covered the streets for months, the cold air biting your lungs every time you stepped outside. There wasn't much to do in those months besides shovel driveways, drink cheap beer, and pray the power didn't go out. By the time I was in my late 20s, I'd moved away to a bigger city. But that winter, 3 years ago, I decided to take some time off and head back to visit my parents. It was supposed to be a quiet week to reset. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. The first mistake was deciding to drive there at night. My parents live in a rural area, down a series of winding roads that feel deserted even in the best weather. That night, a storm had rolled in, and the snow was coming down in thick sheets. I thought I could handle it. I'd grown up driving in conditions like this, after all, but about an hour into the drive, I started to realize I'd made a huge mistake. The snowplows hadn't been out yet, and the road was barely visible. My headlights caught glimpses of trees on either side, their branches heavy with ice. The wind was so loud it felt like the car was being pushed sideways. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles aching, and kept telling myself I was almost there. But then, the car started to sputter. At first, I thought it was just the cold. Maybe the fuel line had frozen or the engine was struggling in the weather. But a few minutes later, the dashboard lit up and the engine died completely. I coasted to the side of the road, the tires skidding slightly on the ice, and sat there in stunned silence as the storm raged around me. I tried restarting the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery light flickered briefly before going dark, and the silence inside the car felt deafening. My phone had no signal. No surprise, considering how remote the area was, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. I couldn't just sit there and wait. The temperature was dropping fast, and with the car dead, I had no heat. I knew I was about 3 miles from a small gas station I'd passed earlier. It was a long walk in the storm, but I didn't have a choice. I wrapped myself in every layer I could find, my coat, scarf, gloves, even a spare blanket I kept in the trunk, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit me like a wall, and for a moment I thought about climbing back into the car and waiting for morning, but the thought of freezing to death in that little metal box pushed me forward. The road was almost invisible under the snow, and every step felt like a battle. The wind whipped around me, carrying sharp needles of ice that stung my face. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beams swallowed by the swirling snow. I kept telling myself to focus on the next step, then the next. My boots crunched in the snow, a sound that somehow felt louder than the storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that the darkness was watching me. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the endless white. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, the faint glow of a sign ahead flickering through the storm. The gas station. The building was old, a squat structure with a faded sign above the door and a single pump out front. The lights inside were dim, but they were on. I felt a wave of relief as I pushed through the door, the bell jangling weakly above me. The inside was as run down as the exterior. The shelves were half empty, stocked with dusty cans and stale snacks. A single clerk stood behind the counter, an older man with a lined face and weary eyes. He barely looked up as I stepped inside, his attention focused on a small radio crackling with static. "Car broke down," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold. "Can I use your phone?" The clerk didn't respond at first. He just stared at the radio, his brow furrowed. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "No phone." Storms knocked out the lines. "Something's wrong." I felt a surge of frustration. "Do you know when the plows will come through? Or if there's anyone else around who can help?" The man finally looked at me then, his eyes narrowing. "No one else is out tonight. Not in this storm." His tone sent a chill through me, colder than the wind outside. I glanced around the store, noticing for the first time how empty it felt. No other customers, no sign of movement outside, just the two of us. "You're welcome to wait here," he said. "Better than freezing out there." I nodded reluctantly and made my way to one of the small tables by the window. The glass was fogged over, but I could still see the snow falling heavily outside. The thought of going back out there made my stomach churn. About an hour later, the bell above the door jingled again. I turned, expecting another stranded driver, but the person who walked in didn't look like they were in trouble. He was tall, dressed in a heavy coat with a hood pulled low over his face. He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge the clerk, just walked straight to the back of the store and disappeared down one of the aisles. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he moved, too quick, too deliberate. Or maybe it was the fact that he didn't even glance at me, as if I wasn't there. Minutes passed, and the stranger didn't come back to the counter. The clerk seemed unfazed, his eyes glued to the radio. I tried to focus on warming up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up, pretending to browse the shelves, and made my way toward the back of the store. The aisle where the man had disappeared was empty. I walked slowly, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of him. When I returned to my seat, the clerk gave me a strange look. "You see something back there?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. A loud crash shattered the silence, coming from somewhere behind the store. Both the clerk and I froze, our eyes meeting. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight from under the counter. He disappeared through a door marked "Employees Only," leaving me alone in the dimly lit store. The minutes dragged on, the sound of the wind outside growing louder. Then I heard it, a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my flashlight and pushed through the same door the clerk had gone through. The back room was cluttered with boxes and tools, the air heavy with the smell of oil. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I turned a corner and froze. The clerk was lying on the floor, blood pooling around his head. His flashlight was still on, casting long shadows across the room. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't try to see who or what was behind me. I bolted out the back door and into the storm, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The snow was blinding, but I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I saw the faint outline of another car on the side of the road, its engine still running. I climbed in without thinking, slamming the door behind me. The driver was slumped over the wheel, but I didn't care. I turned the key, praying the engine wouldn't stall, and peeled out onto the road. I didn't stop driving until I reached my parents' house hours later. I never reported what happened at the gas station. I didn't want to know who or what I had escaped from that night. But every winter, when the snow starts falling and the nights grow long, I think about the man in the store, about the stranger who disappeared, and about the clerk who knew something he didn't live to tell. I've always hated driving in winter. The idea of sliding on black ice or being stranded in the middle of nowhere has kept me close to home during the colder months. But last year, I didn't have a choice. It was mid-January, and a storm was rolling in fast. My mom had called earlier in the day, her voice trembling as she explained that my dad had been rushed to the hospital in the neighboring town. It wasn't life-threatening, she assured me, but he needed surgery, and she wanted me there. The hospital was about an hour's drive from my place, and the thought of leaving my warm apartment to brave the icy roads made my stomach turn. But family comes first, right? I packed a bag, grabbed my coat, and set out around 5 p.m. The sun was already sinking behind the horizon, painting the sky a deep shade of orange that quickly faded into a murky gray. The first half of the drive was uneventful. I stuck to the main roads, where the plows had already cleared most of the snow. Traffic was light, and I let myself relax a little, the sound of my tires crunching against the slush, providing a steady rhythm to the journey. But then I reached the county line. There's a stretch of road between towns that's about 20 miles long, cutting through dense forest and open fields. It's remote, poorly maintained, and only sees a handful of cars on a good day. I'd driven it a few times before and hated it every time. Something about the way the trees seem to close in on you, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snag your car, always put me on edge. That night, the road was worse than I'd ever seen it. The plows hadn't made it that far yet, and a thick layer of snow and ice coated the asphalt. My car slid a little as I turned onto it, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The radio crackled, then cut out entirely, leaving me alone with the sound of the wind howling outside and the faint hum of my engine. About 10 minutes in, I saw the first set of headlights. At first, I was relieved. Another car meant I wasn't completely alone out there, but as I got closer, I realized the vehicle wasn't moving. It was an old sedan, pulled off to the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down, squinting through the snow-speckled windshield to get a better look. The driver's side door was open, and a figure stood next to the car, waving their arms. I hesitated. Stopping on that road was risky. The ice was treacherous, and if another car came barreling down the hill behind me, I'd have no way to get out of the way. But leaving someone stranded in the middle of a snowstorm didn't sit right with me. I rolled down my window just enough to call out, "You okay?" The figure, a man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, hurried over. His face was red from the cold, and his breath came out in visible puffs. "Thank God you stopped," he said. "My car won't start, and my phone's dead. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" I glanced at the passenger seat, where my overnight bag sat. Something about the way he spoke seemed... His voice was shaky, but not just from the cold. It was almost as if he was trying too hard to sound desperate. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I'm in a rush. I can call someone for you when I get to town." His expression darkened. "Please," he said, stepping closer. "It's freezing out here." I shook my head and rolled up the window. His face twisted into something I can only describe as a mix of anger and panic. As I drove away, he slammed his hands against my car, shouting something I couldn't make out. My heart was pounding as I left him behind, the red glow of his hazard lights disappearing into the swirling snow. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me, but the road stayed empty. I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. I couldn't risk letting a stranger into my car. Not on that road, not at night, but the guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. About 5 minutes later, I saw another car. This one was a pickup truck, parked in the middle of the road with its engine running. The driver's side door was open, and the interior light illuminated the cab. I slowed down, my stomach churning. Something was wrong. The truck looked abandoned. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from it, no sign of anyone inside. My pulse quickened as I eased around it, my tires crunching over the ice. The truck's headlights cast long shadows across the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the forest. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the dark like a ribbon of ice. My hands were sweating despite the cold, and I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, willing the minutes to pass faster. Then I heard it, a soft thump. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I checked the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the man from the broken-down car or something else I couldn't explain. But the road behind me was empty. Thump, thump. This time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the trunk. I pulled over, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to get out of the car. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the freezing air. The wind bit at my face as I made my way to the back of the car. The trunk was closed, but the sound was unmistakable now, a steady, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking from the inside. My hands shook as I unlocked it and lifted the lid. The trunk was empty. I stared at the bare interior, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Thump, thump. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the trunk at all. It was coming from the forest. I turned, shining the flashlight into the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just endless rows of bare branches swaying in the wind. But then, about 20 feet in, I saw movement. A figure stood between the trees, half hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I took a step back. The figure didn't follow, didn't make a sound, but the thumping continued, louder and faster now, as if it were echoing from all around me. I jumped back into the car and locked the doors, my breath fogging up the windows as I floored the gas pedal. When I finally reached the hospital, my mom was waiting in the lobby. She hugged me, her face pale with worry, but all I could do was mumble something about the roads being bad. I didn't tell her about the man, or the truck, or the figure in the woods. I didn't tell anyone. The next day, I heard about a body found on that stretch of road. A man in his 50s, frozen to death near a broken-down car. But what really got to me was the news about the pickup truck. It had been stolen the night before, and the driver? He was never found. I've never told anyone this story before, not fully. I don't know if it's because I'm afraid people won't believe me, or if I just don't want to relive it. But with winter here again, and the cold nights pressing in, I can't stop thinking about it. It happened 3 years ago, during one of the harshest winters I can remember. I was living alone at the time in a small rental house outside of town. It wasn't much a rundown place with a leaky roof and thin walls, but it was cheap, and it gave me the space I needed after breaking things off with my fiancé. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much happens. It was surrounded by dense forest, which turned into an endless sea of white during the winter. Beautiful in a way, but isolating too. That night, I was sitting in my living room, trying to ignore the wind howling outside. The weather report had warned of a blizzard, and the power had already flickered a few times. I was bundled up in layers, sipping a mug of lukewarm coffee, when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Paul, a guy I barely knew but had shared a few beers with at the local bar. His message was short, almost frantic. "You around? I need help." Stuck out past Maple Ridge. Maple Ridge was about 6 miles away, a stretch of road that cut through the forest. In good weather, it was an easy drive. But with the storm rolling in, I could see how he might have gotten stuck. I thought about ignoring the message. I didn't know Paul anything, and I wasn't exactly eager to venture out into the storm. But something about the way he worded it, the urgency, the lack of explanation, made me pause. I texted him back, "What happened?" His response came almost immediately. "Car slid off the road. Battery dead. Can't call anyone else. Please, man." I stared at my phone, weighing my options. If his battery was dead, then he really was in trouble. With temperatures dropping as fast as they were, he wouldn't last long without heat. But the idea of driving out in those conditions, in the dark, made my stomach churn. I told myself I'd just go as far as I could. If the roads were too bad, I'd turn back and call for help in the morning. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and a flashlight just in case. The wind hit me like a wall as soon as I stepped outside. Snow was coming down in thick sheets, and the road was already covered in a slick layer of ice. I climbed into my old truck, cranked the heat, and pulled out onto the road. The first few miles were manageable. The snow made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but the truck's tires held their grip on the road. I kept my speed low, my hands tight on the wheel. As I got closer to Maple Ridge, the houses thinned out, replaced by stretches of trees and open fields. The wind howled louder here, the snow swirling in erratic patterns. It felt like the road stretched on forever, disappearing into the dark. I kept an eye out for Paul's car, but there was nothing, just the endless white. I started to wonder if I'd misunderstood his message, or if he'd managed to get help from someone else. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I glanced over to see another text from him. "Almost there. Keep going." I found it about half a mile later. A sedan, half buried in snow, was sitting at an awkward angle off the side of the road. Its headlights were off, and the interior was dark. I pulled over, my tires crunching against the icy shoulder. The wind was deafening as I stepped out of the truck, my flashlight cutting through the storm. I knocked on the windows, then tried the doors. Locked. "Paul!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the wind. No response. I walked around the car, looking for footprints, but the snow had already covered anything that might have been there. My flashlight beam caught something in the distance, what looked like a trail leading into the woods. It was faint, barely visible against the snow, but it was enough. I didn't want to follow it. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my truck and leave. But I couldn't shake the thought of Paul out there, freezing to death. So I pushed forward, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees. The forest felt alive. The wind made the branches creak and groan, and the snow muffled everything else. My boots crunched against the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The trail twisted deeper into the woods, winding between the trees. I kept expecting to see Paul up ahead, huddled against the cold, but there was nothing. just the endless white and the shadows dancing at the edge of my flashlight beam. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it, a cabin barely visible through the snow, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of the storm. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that had been forgotten long before the snow started falling. But the trail led straight to it. I hesitated, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The idea of going inside made my skin crawl, but I couldn't turn back now. If Paul was in there, he needed help. The door creaked open with a push, the sound echoing in the stillness. The air inside was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My flashlight swept across the room, a small table, a few chairs, a wood stove that hadn't seen use in years. "Paul?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Then I saw the door. It was partially hidden behind a stack of firewood, its edges warped and splintered. My flashlight caught the metal handle, slick with frost. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't. I couldn't. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. When it came back on, I froze. The basement was empty. No furniture, no boxes, just a bare concrete floor and walls. But there was something in the center of the room, something I didn't notice at first. A patch of snow, perfectly circular, as if the storm had followed me inside. I don't remember running back to my truck. I don't remember the drive home. All I know is that I locked every door and window and didn't sleep until the sun came up. The next day, I tried calling Paul, but his number didn't work. I asked around town, but no one had seen him. His car was gone when I went back to the road, as if it had never been there. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just the cold messing with my head. Maybe Paul really did find help and didn't bother to let me know. But every winter, when the snow starts falling and the nights grow long, I think about that cabin, about the patch of snow in the basement, and the way it felt like I wasn't alone down there.